Real briefly, we're talking about everything from time of use rates being rolled out to the masses to demand charges or new specialized tariff structures for customers who are equipped with distributed energy resources that can meet the needs of these new energy usage patterns and efforts to integrate renewables and carbon reduction into the grid. Here to talk about what's happening now and what is at stake for years ahead, we have Sonia Agrawal, Vice President at Energy Innovations and Head of America's Power Plan, a really useful resource for analysis of utility and customer sharing of the benefits of innovation on the energy front. To her left, we have Jamie Fine, Senior Economist at the Environmental Defense Fund and Time of Use Wizard, as I like to call him. And last but not least, Sean Gallagher, Vice President for State Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association and an expert on how the rate structures being promulgated in the state today are affecting the long-term prospects of rooftop solar and renewable energy. So let's jump right into it. Sonia, you've done a lot of work on the role of rate design and driving value for distributed energy resources. Can you tell us, how does one create rates that are good for DER while also being good for the general class of ratepayers and the utility and the stability of energy markets and all the rest?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it really is the art of regulation, right? Because I think we all here are quite aware that distributed energy resources are valuable to customers. They're valuable to developers who are looking to put them into the market, and they're also valuable to utilities who can use them to manage the grid more reliably and derive some flexibility from the distribution system that will help them as the bulk grid resources transform. So the question about rate design is really how is that value shared between those different parties, customers, developers, and the utility. And then also the way that rate design impinges on that sharing, I think has a lot to do with how quickly distributed energy resources get deployed and where they get deployed and whether they're being deployed in a way that's going to actually contribute to larger grid flexibility. So I guess the way to sort of think about it in my mind is that customer-facing rate design really looks at how that value can be shared between customers and developers. And then in order for the utility to derive value from the distributed energy resources, there may be some aspects that go into customer-facing rate design, but also because the utilities are regulated entities, there are also other ways that they can be incented to deploy and encourage the deployment of distributed energy resources in particularly valuable areas in the grid. So I'm thinking about the revenue structures and some of the incentives that we're seeing start to be tested here in California via the DER incentive pilots. So that's kind of at a broad level. When you're thinking about rate design that's facing the customer, it's about how do you share that value and drive those distributed energy resources to the points on the grid that they'll be most valuable. And then also, how do you get the utility on board via other incentive mechanisms.
And just to jump into DER incentive pilots are the thing that are coming out of the integration of distributed energy resources proceeding, is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly, that Commissioner Florio.
Yeah. This is like the first time we're going to take all those DRP values that everyone was talking about in the last panel and like assign actual like money procurement solicitation values to them. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. That's a little bit farther ahead. I know that you stress the importance of finding the win-win-win. Mm-hmm. Here. Sean, I don't know if you can talk about how time of use rates as they're developing in California right now are affecting the value of solar and how SEIA has worked to make sure that the values that are being expressed in time of use rates properly reflect not just what's happening, say, on the CAISO markets, but also on the local distribution level. And also, I think about some of the methodologies that you guys got put into the time of use proceeding that are going forward that's going to talk about how to set rates that preserve the state's interest in maintaining, the value of investments in DERs and stuff like that. Because I think the utilities say that these new time of use rates going into later in the day are a direct result of the fact that so much solar is coming in on midday that the old noon to 6, peaks don't make sense anymore. But there's a lot more going on than that.
Sure, and I think as renewables and distributed energy resources, as the penetration starts to increase, we've increasingly started to see utilities take a variety of different approaches towards better aligning system costs and system needs with customer behavior. We saw sort of a round over the last couple of years with utilities proposing increases in fixed costs or proposing demand charges that, in our view, would reduce the economic value of solar and would really slow down the deployment of DERs. In California, where we're focused, and increasingly in other states, New York and Colorado as well, Arizona, we just settled the rate case with time of use rates. Time of use rates are a way to accomplish this, to help better align what customers are doing with what the system needs. And in California, we just had the time of use rulemaking. The Commission issued a decision a couple of months ago. Our approach there was to try to make sure that the time of use peak periods in particular were set correctly, right? And so we saw the utilities arguing, well, look, the net load, the load that's net of wind and solar, is increasingly moving later in the day. And so the peak period should also move later in the day. And in PG&E's case, I think the proposal was to set the peak period to run from 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. at night. Not a lot of solar coming on the grid at 10 p.m. at night, so that was not something we were terribly enthusiastic about. So what we did was we looked at, I think persuaded the Commission that they have to look at more than just marginal generation costs and more than just marginal capacity costs, but also look at T&D. Because yes, the net load is moving later in the day, but the peak load, the actual peak load on the system, the gross peak load, if you will, still is at 5 or 6 p.m. Late in the afternoon on summer days when people are running their air conditioner. So that's when the transmission and distribution system usage peaks, and that's when those marginal costs peak as well. So when you incorporate T&D marginal costs into the calculation of when you set time of use periods, that pulls the peak period back in a little bit. So we're now the Commission in its rulemaking didn't actually set the peak periods, but they adopted a framework or methodology to be implemented in each of the utilities' rate cases. We're in the PG&E rate case right now. We think that the result of this methodology will be that for Edison and San Diego, the peak periods will be something like 2 till 7 p.m. Right, a little later than previously, not as late as the utilities originally proposed. For PG&E, probably something like 3 p.m. till 8 p.m. Okay. Same.
Interesting, and that's a methodology that is influencing solely like the hours that they're picking, right?
That's right.
As far as the prices they actually charge during these different pieces of hours, is there any aspect of a methodology that applies to that you guys are talking about as well?
Yes, and so the rates themselves will also be set in the rate cases.
Right.
And our proposal to the Commission is to provide a menu of options of time of use rates for customers with a sort of default. There's a lot of concern about putting all customers on default time of use rates. Will customers understand it? That sort of thing.
Right.
So our proposal is that the default time of use rate be what we call a time of use light rate, where the differential between the peak period rate and the off-peak period rate is fairly small. That helps minimize the concerns about customers who may or may not really fully understand time of use rates. Although I got to tell you, basic time of use rates with 3 parts, not that hard to understand. Most customers can do it.
Yeah.
But
if I open the mail I get from PG&E, I have a chance.
Yeah, you know in advance with time of use rates, you know in advance when the peak period is going to be, and it's going to be the same. It might be 2 seasons. It might be summer or winter. But you know that on the summer afternoon, the peak period is going to occur at the time that they told you last month on your bill, and you can try to push your use of your dishwasher or your laundry later in the day.
Can you talk about where you see the need for these kind of specialized rates and how they fit into a world where most of us aren't going to do this stuff, and we want to make sure that we're not paying for those special people?
Sure, happy to. First, I should mention I'm with Environmental Defense Fund. We're a national, increasingly international environmental advocacy group. So in California, in the context of this conversation, we have our eyes on really 2 important outcomes. In the near term, we want to be sure that the communities in California that have historically and are currently still being disadvantaged by the emissions associated with our wonderfully productive economy in the state experience benefits and relief in the near term. And as we're achieving that, we know we have a long-term design goal of getting 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions out of the system, at 1990 level emissions out of the system by 2050. That's a tall task, and that essentially means we need to electrify ground transport at the same time we take all the carbon out of our electricity system. So why is EDF, an environmental advocacy group, bullish on time variant rates? Well, we certainly see distributed energy resources, clean distributed energy resources. We're not talking about individual diesel generators in people's homes, but clean distributed energy resources like energy efficiency, storage, self-generation, and a very important piece that EDF has our eyes on, which is customers responding to prices, shifting their demand in response to time of use price periods. We are bullish on DERs as a clean resource that customers want, but it's also a means to the end. We see it as a least cost strategy to meet our RPS goals, that is the decarbonization of our electricity goals. Quick numbers for you. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs was hired by the CPUC to study the potential for demand response in California. They estimate that in 2025, without customers responding to time of use rates, we'll be dumping about 12% of the renewable capacity we'll have in the system. These are utility scale renewables and rooftop generation that we're building to meet our RPS goals. If, however, through time of use rates and good marketing education and outreach, we can affect a 20% load shift to align customers' load with when we have solar and wind plentiful on the grid, we reduce the amount of curtailment in the system from curtailing 12% of that capacity down to 2% curtailment. We're already dumping renewables. We're dumping renewables much faster than CAISO forecasted we would just a few years ago. You heard Lorenzo from CAISO talk about the need to do a better job of forecasting. So we see that coming, and we know time of use rates is going to be a key strategy to open the least cost pathway to meeting our greenhouse gas goals. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, for individual customers adopting distributed energy resources, we all are quite familiar with rooftop solar, and we're enamored with notions of increasing investments in storage. I had a conversation with a storage company about 3 years ago, and the conversation went like this. I've got a great battery, and I can provide service to a household with this battery, and I can help that household avoid using energy from the grid when prices are peaking. However, if the time of use rate is designed such that the peak price starts at 7 a.m., and ends at 7 p.m., I can't really provide you a cost-effective battery that can float your house for 12 hours. But if that house was exposed to prices that change on the hour or the half hour, my battery can provide an enormous amount of value and service. So that's the point when I recognize that these relatively coarse time of use rates aren't necessarily the right design to truly reward the type of services that distributed energy resources could provide to both the customer and the grid. Okay. I should probably leave it at that for now.
Okay, so we need less coarse time of use rates.
For customers who optionally want to adopt the practices and technologies that would be involved. We're enamored with the shiny new battery type of product, but we have an enormous amount of storage capacity in our homes and thermal storage capacity, as Mr. Green from Nest pointed out in the prior panel.
Very interesting. Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe we could talk about what a kind of a tariff like this might look like. Sean, you mentioned the battery storage rate that you're suggesting. I think EDF, you guys have suggested a smart home rate.
Yeah.
Is there any way to just describe briefly to people what do those rates look like? Where are they getting their price reference? How are those price reference doing what you want them to do in terms of like reducing curtailment? Increasing, adoption of clean solutions on distributed energy solutions. And Sonia, maybe you can tell us, as they say, whether or not this is the right utility customer developer balance that they're maintaining.
A good point. I think, and I'll preemptively critique Jamie's proposal. But one of the things to keep in mind is achieving that right balance, right? Mm-hmm. Achieving the right balance of risk between, for example, the utility and the customer. So I think our battery storage rate is going to look a little bit different. Our proposed battery storage rate is going to look a little bit different than what EDF has proposed with SDG&E. It'll be sort of a short peak time of use peak period with a high on-peak rate, and a large differential between the peak rate and the off-peak rate. I think when I don't think we've specified the details yet, but when we were talking about it last fall, it was on the order of maybe 50 cents a kilowatt hour for the peak rate.
50
cents a kilowatt hour for the peak rate. And that would again encourage the customer to put storage in. The idea is anyway to encourage the customer to use that storage and to shift their load and provide some benefits to the grid.
Yeah.
I think our concern with the home rate that EDF has proposed is that customer could be taking too much risk and there could be a little bit too much certainty for the utility, and that's the balance we want to achieve.
And that's because they're running off of like wholesale prices?
Well, I'll let Jamie describe it.
Yeah, actually, so the rate I would actually point folks to is the experimental rate that San Diego Gas and Electric is proposed to utilize in their vehicle grid integration pilot. And that's a day-ahead dynamic hourly rate. So the notion is before you go to bed, you pull up your iPhone app for your EV charging, and you look at what SDG&E thinks the prices are going to be by hour tomorrow. And so when you go into work and you park your car and plug it in, you've already told your car which hours you want it to charge based on the price that was forecasted. Now that could update in real time. I should mention that the notion there is that responsive ability of your car and the ability for a customer to plan. I agree that the concern that this is maybe too risky for many customers. I would note that this also is an attractive, profitable opportunity for customers who want to take on that risk.
Right.
And so this was a concept in this rate design, which we call the smart home rate, was one actually we thought through working with SDG&E and a battery storage provider. But I should mention that that's one example of a rate that could reward storage capabilities. And it's not just a rate. When we learn more about where storage would be particularly valuable through the distributed resources planning locational net benefits analysis, we could add other value propositions to that, such as incentives, or perhaps fees if you're going to cite something that could cause costs. So you can signal the investment in these with not just the rate, but other incentives as well.
I think the key point is the optionality, so that we provide a couple of different options for customers for those that can respond, will respond. And one of the ideas, another idea that we propose is this discount day proposals, and not dissimilar in concept to what EDF is talking about, where on a day-ahead basis, the utility would notify customers that tomorrow is going to be a high production day for renewable resources, for example, a low load day. We'll give you a super discount rate to use power during that defined period tomorrow.
Right. Right. And I guess I might take both of these concepts, very interesting, and wrap them back to Sonia along with a question from our audience, which is, why should retail rate design even focus on supporting a technology instead of focusing on distributing costs fairly among customers? While doing everything else California wants to do. We got to get that in there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should focus on distributing costs fairly across customers, but I think that there are also ways to unlock what is really truly latent value in the distribution system that rates have the ability to start to unlock. So I think that all of what's been discussed makes a lot of sense, especially if there are aggregators or some automation technology that can handle a lot of that those changes for the customer, because the reason why rates should be looking for that latent value in the system is because it can reduce the overall system cost for customers as we decarbonize our electricity system. So it's not that a rate should be looking for one technology or the other. It's that we should be looking for the value that already exists in the distribution system and that developers are looking to build in the distribution system so that we can actually use that to lower overall system costs even as we decarbonize.
Well, I think in our conversation, Jamie, you mentioned that Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD, went to time of use rates. Their main
going to in 2018.
Yeah, and they're looking at the ability to avoid building new peaker plants. That's a direct value that, I can't complain if I don't have solar and my neighbor does and they're getting a special rate if I also just avoided paying my fair share for a new peaker plant, right? So I guess that's...
Exactly. PG&E already canceled $200 million of planned T&D investments as a result of renewables coming onto the system.
Yeah.
So I mean, Sonia's exactly right. DERs are providing value to the system, and that's and rate design is where the rubber hits the road for those DERs. So I think the idea is, and what California is trying to do with this, I think someone said yesterday there's something like a dozen proceedings going on right now at the commission where DERs are being addressed.
Right.
We make it more complicated than anybody else does just because we do, but we're trying to achieve our goals, and you got to remember, customers want solar. And so you got to find ways to give customers what they want and try to do so in a way that's productive for the system as a whole.
Yeah. How much are utilities prepared for this? I don't know who does rate design in utilities and what math degrees they have to figure out the probability that the rates they're setting for 3 years in the future are going to bankrupt or not the company. I have no idea how the complexity of that increases as you start opening up all these variable rates, which no one might sign up for, or surprisingly, like thousands and thousands of people might sign up for, and how you manage that.
Maybe because you worked with SDG&E on this very topic, you should.
Yeah, so one thing to point out, of course, is that the system of pricing we're moving away from tiers has built into it its own set of cross subsidies and
Sure.
complexities, right, and disconnects from true cost causation. Time of use rates better aligns cost causation, so the notion that we're kind of doing this just for rooftop solar is the wrong way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
So those who are not peaky, using energy at peak time now are subsidizing those who are, for example. We have locational subsidies built into the system as well. So we should be careful when we think about what's subsidizing what and kind of take a look at the whole picture. I should point out this concern about cost is a very real one, and it's a concern in both the near term as we move customers from tiered to time of use rates. As we're doing that, we're testing that now with opt-in time of use rates in the residential, all three utilities. But starting in 2018, we're going to be testing defaulting about 500,000 customers to time of use rates. And our analysis already shows that customers are going to experience bill increases in the summertime because prices are going to better follow cost causation. Now, they will get those savings back in the wintertime. That is, the utility is not going to collect any additional revenue in net. But we're very concerned about customers, particularly customers who have high energy burdens, and say in the Central Valley, will experience bill hardships by seeing their bills go up $5 to $10 per month, even if they kind of get those reductions later in the year. Compare that to this ability to dump less renewables in 2025. That LB&L study I referred to, they estimate an annual savings of up to $700 million a year of not dumping renewables. That's a savings per customer today in the system of about $60 to $70 per customer. So, but that's a far-off savings, right? And we need to actually have the system working in the near term as we enjoy those savings going forward.
That gets complicated. You know, in terms of, you know, greenhouse gas, you know, carbon reduction is going to be the big, you know, push forward, as Commissioner Picker said. You know, but I have just one question from the audience. What about, you know, the fact that when you charge your batteries or charge your EV at night, you may or may not be taking on more fossil power than you would be if you were charging them at midday or something? Is there a way to, although it could be wind as well at night? Shoot, I don't know. Is anyone working on calculating the real-time kind of carbon load of the energy you're using as part of some kind of function at time of use rates or special rates?
I think there are people calculating the marginal CO2 on an hourly basis, but I guess I would say, you know, if you think about the system holistically, as we move toward a more decarbonized system, we're going to have a different mix at different times of the day, and the overall direction of the system is going to be, you know, moving toward lower and lower carbon. And so I think on an individual customer basis, first of all, I don't think that most customers will use that as a way to decide when to charge things or use electricity. But even for the ones that are concerned about the carbon impact of their behavior, I think thinking of this as a dynamic system that not every single individual customer has to manage, but instead that this is one piece of a very large portfolio of assets that are working together to get us toward this decarbonized system. The value of providing flexibility is actually going to drive us more toward a lower carbon overall system in the longer term. So even if on a marginal basis you're using a little bit more in a certain hour, you're still helping the overall system move in the right direction.
I think that's right, and rates can influence that behavior as well, right? Today, customers are incentivized to charge their cars overnight in most places because that's when they get a super low rate. In the not too distant future, we're going to see customers incentivized to charge their vehicles in midday, because that's when the solar power peaks.
Yeah. Hey, I should probably take some time to talk about how all this rate design stuff is going to affect net metering.
Before you get there, I wanted to make a point about the electric vehicle piece here. So it's true, we have the good news that you could actually align low price with cleanest energy too. EDF does believe that customers are motivated not purely by price, and that to the extent that you could signal to customers that, hey, this is a clean time of the day too, that should be a toggle function that customers could select for when they're deciding when to charge their car. The other really important piece here, so EDF, we just submitted comments on the 3 California IOUs transportation electrification plans earlier this week. And one big piece missing from those plans, well, 2 big pieces. One is this plan for doing managed smart charging with good price signaling. But the other really big piece is not just vehicle or grid to vehicle, that is having our vehicles take energy during the so-called belly of the duck time of the day and avoid taking energy at the head time of the day. That's V1G, vehicles take the energy. But what about V2G, vehicles offering energy back into the grid? You heard Mark Martinez yesterday talk about a 2-hour ramp. Well, you know, if I'm going to work late tomorrow, why don't I let my car buy me lunch or buy me dinner, right? By selling a little bit of the energy in my battery back into the grid, right? That's something we can and should be planning for, and if we don't do it, we're going to build other stuff to do it, and that's going to be expensive.
Right, right. I guess we got to talk to the automakers about the warranty issues involved from tapping it better. But
where there's a will, there's a way,
right.
And there isn't, at this point, financial will on the side of our investor-owned utilities to do this.
Right. Now, I know that net metering is really basically in 2019, I believe, you know, the net metering is supposed to be kind of redone again. It's going to include all kinds of new expressions of value, like maybe, you know, DRP rates, LNBA rates, and stuff like that. But it's also going to be heavily influenced by, you know, the rates designs we're setting in place now with time of use and stuff. How does all this stuff we're talking about affect net metering's future post-2019?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to plan now for that, and we're trying to be proactive in places like New York and California, where we see high levels of penetration of distributed resources, and recognize that states are going to move towards successors to net metering. So, you know, there's net metering 3.0 planning going on now. I think you're right. It's going to incorporate locational and temporal values. New York actually came out with an order today that does that for larger solar resources. Right. And we expect to see that in California. And some of the pilots that Sonia mentioned earlier will play into what those values are. The locational net benefit analysis, the ICA, the capacity analysis are going to play into how we set those values in 2019.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Is everyone involved getting all the data they need to make their own judgments about whether these values are true expressions of value? I wonder about that.
Well, so far the LMBA stuff, I agree with Ryan Hanley that our IOU folks have worked hard on pushing forward this methodology, and we're leading the world in it. With that said, there's room for improvement, right? So one obvious area where there's room for improvement is that we won't, at the end of this year, have locational net benefits analysis calculations for every part of the grid. And that's something that certainly our DER developers would like to have to guide them in their business development, right? At this point in the process, we're developing LMBA calculations for individual project areas, which are getting us to understanding LMBA values on the entire grid. But we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'd agree that the ICA is further along than the LMBA in terms of its development.
Yeah. And then to really do it right, ICA and LMBA actually need to dynamically talk to each other. That is, ICA is integration capacity analysis. What's the capacity of your distribution system to host, say, more rooftop solar? And you can say, well, this system's got 10 rooftop solar systems plugged in, and it looks like our transformer could handle a couple more, unless we have a price signal for storage and good behavior and practices on that side of the meter. And now you can maybe host another 10 rooftop solar systems. So there actually should be a dynamic relationship between LMBA understanding the values on that side of the meter with new DERs, the price signaling that those DERs get, and then updating your ICA calculations based on that. That's a couple years off.
Okay, sounds good. Yes, that's something to work on, perhaps over lunch, because I believe we're out of time. But thank you again, Sonia, Jamie, Sean. It's been a great discussion, and thank you all for giving us such great questions.
Thank you.